Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring this video.
3 days ago, the ship had cracked in two, and now the wreckage was covered in ice. It was pummeled by hurricane-force winds and by waves dozens of feet high. And somehow, everyone on board was still alive. There were 24 of them, but for how long? No one knew. Outside was the white hurricane, and inside, they had no way of knowing if help was on the way. This is the somehow true story of the LC Waldo. Here around Lake Superior, the gales of November are infamous. For many, that phrase, gales of November, was made famous by a Gordon Lightfoot song, but it's also something you can actually catch me muttering to myself when I check the weather forecast every fall. In November, you don't mess with the wind on Lake Superior. Why the gales of November happen can have a fairly involved answer, but the short version is that time of year, cold air from Canada meets up with warm air from the Gulf. This creates low pressure systems and storms that ultimately move over the Great Lakes. And because the lakes are still relatively warm in November, those storms can then pick up even more energy. Some of the most deadly storms on the Great Lakes have happened in November, including the one that famously sank the Edmund Fitzgerald and her crew in 1975. But this story starts more than 60 years before the Fitz, on November 7th, 1913. Here, we find the LC Waldo, a roughly 450-foot steamer loaded with iron ore, headed down from Minnesota. On board were 22 crewmen, plus 2 women, both family members of the ship's steward, and they had no idea what was coming. At this time, gale warnings were communicated using flags or lanterns hung outside of Weather Bureau stations along the coast. This normally happened 12 to 24 hours in advance, but if you weren't near shore during that time, your only indications that bad weather was on the way were the sky and whatever skills or instruments you had as a sailor. And even for ships that were near the coast on November 7th, well, this was 1913. Meteorologists didn't have the kind of data we do today. So even they didn't know how bad this was about to be. 2 winter storms were converging on the Great Lakes, and what history will remember as the White Hurricane was about to begin. Late on November 7th, the first of these storms struck the Waldo, and things went downhill fast. Only hours after their departure, enormous waves struck the ship and damaged the pilot house, the ship's command center. The captain, John Duddleson, made it out, but he had a new problem. The waves had damaged the steering gear, washed away the navigational equipment, and knocked out the lights. The storm raged in the darkness, and he couldn't be sure exactly which direction they were going. With some quick thinking, one of the crewmen allegedly ran to a lifeboat or another part of the ship and found a basic handheld compass. They set it up on a stool, lit a lantern, and that's the only way they could navigate. But out there in the night, beyond the warm glow of the lantern, was the rocky, unforgiving shore of the Keweenaw Peninsula. From November 7th to 10th, the winter storm called the White Hurricane devastated the Great Lakes. Over those 4 days, waves got as tall as 35 feet, and wind gusts were measured up to 90 miles an hour. Literally hurricane-force winds. And to make matters so much worse, these were also whiteout blizzard conditions. Ships caught in the storm quickly became covered in ice, making navigation difficult to impossible. By the end, there were millions of dollars worth of damages, at least 250 sailors were lost, and there were a dozen shipwrecks across every Great Lake except Ontario. In terms of number of ships lost, this storm is still the largest inland maritime disaster in US history. But what was the fate of the Waldo? Off the coast of the Keweenaw, they were doing remarkably well with their little compass, reportedly staying within half a mile of Captain Duddleson's intended course. But in these waters, you don't have much margin for error. And very early on November 8th, it finally happened. The ship smashed into a small island off the tip of the Keweenaw, called Gull Rock. Here, the exact accounts of what happened next vary, but the end result is that the ship ultimately broke in two and the engines were knocked out. Everyone on board managed to find safety at the front of the ship, but no engines meant no heat. And in these frigid conditions, no heat meant your hours were numbered. So in a stroke of what I think was genius, the ship's engineer ran to the captain's quarters and ripped out his bathtub. He flipped it upside down, then kicked the bottoms out of metal buckets used to haul water. Stack the buckets and feed one end out the window, position the other end on top of the bathtub drain, and behold, you've got yourself a sheltered fireplace. Under the captain's orders, the crew either started tearing out any wood they could find to build and feed a fire, or they did exercises to keep as warm as possible. But this couldn't last forever. For one, there was very little food, at most maybe a little tomatoes or peaches, but also with every wave that struck the Waldo, the layer of ice on the broken ship grew. The first day aboard the Shipwreck turned to night, and then back to day, and again, back to night. The wind roared and the ice grew, and 36 hours later, the storm showed no sign of slowing down. Now, by a stroke of luck, someone did know that the Waldo was out there. By late Saturday, less than 24 hours after the wreck, news had reached the Eagle Harbor life-saving station that a ship was stuck on Gull Rock. Still, the winds were blowing at some 70 miles an hour, whipping water and snow into an impenetrable blanket of white. So rescue seemed anything but likely. But there was this motto in the U.S. Life-Saving Service. You have to go out, it said, but you don't have to come back. So out went men from Eagle Harbor in a 26-foot powerboat. Watching them leave, one local resident is reported as saying something to the effect of, "You better wire Washington to send another crew. Those boys are never coming back." But come back they did, just not with the Waldo. They only made it 8 miles before ice began to swallow their boat, too. When they reached the safety of the harbor, they allegedly had to be chipped out of the boat with small axes because they were frozen to their seats. Now, by the next morning, Monday, news had reached another life-saving station, the Portage, down near the city of Houghton. They were much farther from the Waldo, and their safest route in the storm involved traveling 80 miles to the wreck site, down the Portage Canal, out the South Entry, and then all the way up Keweenaw Bay. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking on Gull Rock. It was Monday. They'd wrecked early on Saturday. Every hour that passed meant less food, less water, and less hope for survival. And what did they do during those hours? I don't know. Maybe they played games, or tried to sleep, or prayed, or just talked about anything besides the obvious, that as far as they knew, no one would be able to reach them. But at the Eagle Harbor and the Portage life-saving stations, they were certainly trying. By Monday evening, the storm had begun to calm down at long last. And while others reckoned with the damage of the White Hurricane to their ships, their friends, their family, both stations set out yet again, trying to prevent one more crew from being counted among the dead. From the Portage station left Captain McCormick and his team. They then met up with Captain Nelson and his tugboat, who pulled the lifeboat north, all the way to the point of the peninsula, a 14-hour trip. They arrived around 3 a.m. the next day, on November 11th, and waited for daylight. Meanwhile, around the time the Portage crew was arriving at the Waldo, another team set out once again from the Eagle Harbor station. And this time, they were successful, reaching the wreck around 7 a.m. But by this point, it was now Tuesday morning. The Waldo had been frozen on Gull Rock for 3 days, and I have to wonder if any of the rescuers questioned who was left to save. And when the men had chipped a hole through the ice and could see inside the ship, who was alive? Everyone. All 24 of them. According to one author, a surfman named Anthony Glaza reported that some members of the Waldo's crew had towels wrapped around their heads. Others were wearing socks for mittens, but most people had neither. So when the rescue crews got them into the lifeboats, they bundled everyone up as best they could and then got them on Captain Nelson's tugboat bound for Houghton. The women cried for joy when we wrapped them in warm blankets, the surfman said. And when we put them on the tug, they offered up a prayer of thanksgiving and asked the blessing of heaven upon our captain and his crew. In the end, no one was lost aboard the LC Waldo, and shockingly, not even the ship itself was lost. Not for good. Even though the insurance company called it a total loss, the company American Shipbuilding down in Ohio salvaged and rebuilt the vessel. Although, to be honest, I am half convinced this thing was cursed. In 1915, she was sold to a Canadian company and renamed the Riverton, only to wreck in Lake Huron about 30 years later in 1943. Then she was rebuilt and renamed again, this time as the Mohawk Deer, and made it another 20 years before being sold for scrap in 1967. The plan was to tow her to Italy for parts, but off the Italian coast, the ship broke free and wrecked one more time. And if you ever find yourself near Portofino, the ship once known as the LC Waldo, where 24 people spent 3 days clinging to survival on Gull Rock, is now a popular diving site. If you're ever in Eagle Harbor, the Life-Saving Station is now a museum that's open in the summer and fall. But for now, let's go inside and make some hot chocolate. I got one more thing to share with you.
So earlier I mentioned NordVPN is the sponsor for this video. Here's why. There are a couple of things to know about me. One, I'm a fairly private person, and two, I click a lot of weird links while researching these videos. So when a company makes something that makes my experience online safer and more anonymous, I'm often interested. And I think NordVPN does this well. They're probably best known for their virtual private networks, or VPNs. They allow you to log onto the internet using thousands of servers around the world, which lets you hide your location from websites, among other things. But a feature I didn't know about is Threat Protection Pro. It protects you from downloading malware, checks websites for viruses, scams, and phishing attacks, and can also stop websites from tracking you around the internet. I actually use NordVPN, and I really appreciate this safety net. And honestly, thinking back to the amount of junk I famously downloaded onto my dad's laptop as a kid, I think I would appreciate this even more if I had a bigger family. You can learn more at nordvpn.com/Alexis Dahl. If you use that link, you will get a very substantial discount on a 2-year plan, plus another 4 months for free, which is the best deal they're currently offering. They also have a 30-day money-back guarantee, and of course, if you check out that link, you will also be supporting this series. Again, that's nordvpn.com/Alexis Dahl, or you can click the link in the description. Thanks for considering supporting the sponsors who support this series. And as always, thank you for being here. I hope you learned something that makes you think about the world just a little differently, and I'll see you soon.